Hello, and welcome to Three Rivers Homestead. This is Jessica, and I am the host of the Three Rivers Challenge. This is a pantry challenge that we do both on YouTube and on Instagram during the months of January and February. And in this video, I'm going to be bringing you some of the meals that we made here in our house during the pantry challenge in the second half of this video. But first, I wanted to talk about some of the other fun projects that were going on the homestead here this week. Here in Northwest Ohio, we are in growing zone 6B, and so it is time for us to begin starting some of our garden seeds that have a longer growing seed or longer germination time that need to be ready for planting out. We usually plant out on Mother's Day weekend. So typically in about the middle of February, I begin my pepper seeds. I'll do some things like loofah gourd seeds if I were starting onions from seed or asparagus. This is the time of year that I would start those things. And then this year I'm also experimenting with starting some broccoli seeds earlier, just because I'm trying to figure out a way to grow them where they don't bolt as soon as I plant them out. And so I'm hoping that starting them a little sooner will help with that this year. Now this grow light setup that I am putting together here, I love it. It's so convenient. It's on wheels. We've had this for about 7 years. I think this is the seventh season that I will be using it. So I can just wheel it right in from storage and get it set up. And then I use solo cups. These are solo cups that I rescued originally from a family gathering. They were going into the trash and I was like, wait, everybody put these here in this bag and I'll take them home and clean them out. All I had to do was poke holes in the bottom of the solo cups for drainage, and then I could start my seeds in them. And I reuse them. I'm giving them a good washing in the sink to get out any bacteria and whatever was left over from last year's growing season. And then we can replant these. So this is a great way to repurpose something and use it for planting. So Elizabeth and I are going to get busy planting these seeds, and I will show you the seed packets as she's planting them to show you the varieties that we chose this year. We're only doing maybe one or two each of our hot pepper plants, and then we did a lot more, obviously, of our bell peppers and the broccoli that we were planting today. But that grow light stand that I showed you is the only indoor seed starting space that we have here on our homestead. We do not have a greenhouse, and I showed you in last week's video how we sort of make little mini plastic jug greenhouses, and that's where I start a lot of my cold hardy plants, perennial herbs, flowers, things that I don't necessarily need to germinate until maybe early April, late March. That's typically when those plastic jugs get warm enough for the seeds to germinate. But the things that I start indoors are things that I need to germinate as early as possible because they just take a really long time for them to fruit and to fully mature. Things like hot peppers really do take a long time, so I need to start them now in order to have them change color and be fully ripened by the time we harvest them in maybe September. So because I'm so limited on my indoor growing space, I really am selective about what I choose to start from seeds. Besides my peppers, I really do focus on tomatoes, and that's because these are plant starts that I can't go to local greenhouses and buy. When I go to local greenhouses, they typically have pretty standard selections of tomato and pepper options, and there are some types of peppers and tomatoes that I like to grow that just really aren't that common. And so that's why I prioritize starting these things from seed. I find that because we are in zone 6B, most of the things that I grow, I can wait to direct sow into the garden in usually the end of April. And then for the things that aren't cold hardy, I will wait till we plant out in mid-May. So I really do not have the need to start a lot of things. I mean, if we did have a greenhouse in the future, there are some things that I would start earlier just to get a jump on the growing season, but this works for us so far. So now the broccoli that we're planting right now, Last year I didn't do a lot of broccoli. I typically avoid planting brassicas. Brassicas are your cole crops, things like kale, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, because the cabbage moths are so terrible here, and we struggle with these plants bolting before we get a chance to harvest anything from them. But I am experimenting this year and trying to make it work. We're going to do floating row cover to prevent pest damage because broccoli and cabbage are two things we are really missing right now on the pantry challenge. I would love to have had more cabbage down in the root cellar in the our cold storage available to eat throughout the challenge, and I'm really missing broccoli and wish that we had a lot of that blanched and frozen and available for meals. So that's another wonderful thing about doing a pantry challenge during the time that we're garden planning and beginning to think about what we want to grow this year, because it's fresh on our minds the things that we really miss and that we didn't grow enough of during last year's growing season. So it was really exciting to get our hands in some dirt and plant more seeds. And I'm going to really enjoy watching everything germinate here in the kitchen. I love having this in the kitchen because there's a lot of light here at the window. It's also really easy to water with the sink nearby. And I can't wait to see little tiny sprouts peeking out of these cups. It's just a sign that spring is coming, and pretty soon we're going to be outside enjoying time in the garden. We just have to get through the rest of February. And part of getting through February is finishing out this pantry challenge strong. So I've been really going through the freezer and finding things that have been neglected. I found 2 gallon-sized bags of rooster legs. They're the basically just the legs of old roosters or young roosters that we hatched out that we didn't need here on the homestead. So I put them in a roasting pan here and covered them with water and just let them slow roast for about 18 hours or so. And then we are going to do some canning and cooking on this day to make a chicken and rice meal. We're also going to can some of the meat and broth and then do another batch of just plain chicken broth. So I'll take you along on that process. The first thing I'm doing is just ladling out enough broth to fill my crock pot here for dinner. And then I'm going to start filling jars to get all of the broth here, out of the roasting pan, so that we can then start picking apart the meat that is in here. Now, a lot of people ask, what is rooster meat like? Well, how is that different than chicken that you would purchase in the store? And roosters that you allow to age for a while, they are very tough. The meat is very tough. It's kind of like an old hen. If you've ever had the meat from an older hen that is past her egg laying days, the meat gets rather tough. And so it's really only good for stewing. So if you cook it really long and on a low heat, and then I find the canning process too really helps tenderize it and makes it something that you can turn into a soup. And so that is what I'm doing here. I'm pulling out all of those legs. The great thing about legs is that there's really only 2 big bones in there. So I'm just pulling out the bones and then filling my jars here with the rest of the meat. I also filled my crock pot with enough of the meat to make 1 batch of soup for that night's dinner. So as I mentioned, this is really my focus here in these last weeks of the pantry challenge before we get really busy here in the garden, because I have lots of bones and meat and things that I need to clear out of the freezer before they just get forgotten when we get busy this summer. And so getting them cooked up and in jars for ready-made meals, that will come in really handy on these days in the coming months where we're spending all day out in the garden working and planting and cleaning things up. I can come in and just dump some jars into a pot and make some quick meals. So we're going to get this meat and broth canned up. First thing I need to do is get my jars and my lids and rings on. I use 4 jars canning lids, and if you would like some, check out the code in the video description. You can get 10% off. So we are canning a batch of meat, which we'll process for 90 minutes, and we're doing a batch of just the plain chicken broth without meat in it, and those quarts will process for 25 minutes, both in the pressure canner. And when I'm done, I have beautiful shelf-stable jars of meat and broth for future meals. Now, I wanted to show you what happens if you allow too significant of a temperature difference. I pulled these out of the pressure canner too fast, and look, one of these jars siphoned out. It sort of exploded and bubbled, and it kind of shocked me when it happened. So I want to let you know that that jar did end up sealing, but I do not trust the seal of that because there's some of the grease that might have slipped under the lid. So I set that aside to use quickly. Now here is the meat and broth that was left over. I went ahead and put in a cube of pureed garlic scape puree. I'm going to add 1 pint of canned carrots with the broth that the carrots were canned in, as well as 1 pint of butternut squash and that squash broth. Then it's time to start adding our freeze-dried ingredients. I'm going to sprinkle in some freeze-dried spinach powder. I also have freeze-dried celery from last year's garden. This makes a great addition to soups. It's a really wonderful way to use that up. And then I have the rest of this jar of freeze-dried onions. And that is basically it for the freeze-dried ingredients. Now we're going to do some of our seasonings. I'm just going to add a handful here of bay leaves. We're going to also sprinkle in some thyme, and then of course we will salt and pepper it. Now every time I make a chicken soup like this, I sort of change up the starch that I'm adding. Sometimes we'll do noodles, but today I decided to add rice. This is a crock pot meal on a busy night. So a little bit before lunchtime, I went ahead and put the rice here and got all of this put together, added the rest of the broth, and then I could get this crock pot on low. And then by the time we came home from our activities in the evening, that soup was ready to go and the rice was thoroughly cooked. So I absolutely love my crock pot. I don't know how I would get dinner on the table on our busy extracurricular activity nights if it weren't for tools like the crock pot. So by this point in the pantry challenge, I've shared most of our staple meals that we make on a continual basis. So I'm trying to find other new ideas that I haven't shared for you yet. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in the rest of this video. This week, I thought, wouldn't it be fun if I made the kids a homemade version of SpaghettiOs? So I'm going to show you how I made that. Here are the ingredients that I pulled from the pantry. And I had purchased this pasta last fall and totally forgotten about it. They're adorable little vegetable alphabet pastas, organic. I got these in bulk from Azure Standard, and I had about 6 packages of it. Now we're going to make a sauce out of home canned tomato sauce. I have a little bit of tomato paste. We're going to use some thyme, some garlic puree, freeze-dried onions, and homegrown honey. We're just going to get all of those ingredients together in a pot, and I'm just trying to get that garlic puree to melt since that was frozen. And then once that melts up, we're just going to blend everything together, get the garlic pieces and the onion bits in there all smooth to make our SpaghettiO sauce. And then we cooked up our little alphabet pasta. I have 2 little guys in my house right now. One of them is working on learning his letter sounds, and the other one is working on just letter recognition. So making pasta like this is super fun for them as they get excited when they recognize one of the shapes that they see in their bowl. And so the key to making this taste like those SpaghettiOs that you can get out of the can is making them sweet enough with the honey, and then it's that thyme flavor. There's something about that combination that really does kind of give it that SpaghettiO taste. And so this was just a really simple lunch that we made one day. Everybody got a kick out, even the older kids got a kick out of the letters that were in their pasta and were having fun trying to see what words they could spell as they were eating it. And you could see little Miss Hannah here, who is 14 months old, also thought that it was a hit. Now I'm going to share some of the breakfast ideas that I had for this week. Breakfast is my favorite meal to make. I think it's because early in the morning the kids are still asleep and the house is quiet, and I really just have the time and energy from waking up to focus on making something really creative and fun for the kids. So every good breakfast lately starts with grinding some kind of flour because we are out of pre-ground flours. And for this breakfast, we are going to make sourdough waffles. In previous videos, I shared with you my regular waffle recipe, but now I wanted to show you how I make a sourdough waffle. So I started by putting 3 cups of sourdough starter in the bottom of my bowl. I'm going to triple the recipe here that I showed. And then to that, I'm going to add about 6 cups of flour and also 6 cups of almond milk. I am omitting the sugar from this recipe because I just really don't feel like it's necessary. I never put sugar in my waffle or pancake batter because I know we're going to add sugar on top of the pancake or waffle in the form of syrup later on. Got my little helper talking to me, and we're just getting those 3 ingredients mixed together, and we're going to let this sit out and ferment overnight on the counter. I just cover it with a towel, and then when I woke up the next morning, that sourdough had fermented. It smells like sourdough. It smells really lovely, and now we're going to get busy adding the rest of our ingredients to our waffle batter. So the first thing we need to add is 6 eggs. Next, we're adding 3/4 a cup of olive oil. I'm going to add about 1½ teaspoons of salt and then 3 teaspoons of baking soda. And that is all that we need in order to make these waffles. Now I find that since all of the ingredients are pretty wet, the oil does have a hard time mixing into the batter, and so I like to get out my immersion blender and really work it in well together, and I find that that does a good job. And then we're just spooning it out into our waffle maker and making delicious waffles. And in the meantime, while I'm busy doing that, I'm going to work on making some coconut whipped cream. And I did this before for you guys in a previous video and showed you how it kind of had a waterier texture than normal whipped cream. And I received some great feedback in the comments from a couple of you that I wanted to try out. So the first thing I'm doing is blending down all of that fat that has been solid at room temperature and getting it broken up. And then I'm adding about 1/2 cup of powdered sugar to that 1 can of coconut cream. That is more than I typically add, but I think having more powdered sugar will help it firm up a little bit. And then also, you guys gave me some feedback and you said that many of you use 2 of these cartridges of the gas in order to get it to whip up better. So that's what I did. I released 1 cartridge into the container and then added another one so that there was double the amount of gas there before I poured it out. And so I'm getting ready. I'm shaking it up really good. I poured my maple syrup onto my waffle here, and I'm kind of hesitant because sometimes it comes out really fast and it splashes up. So I'm trying to be very slow about letting it come out. And I was very pleased to find that it was definitely a better texture. So I'm not sure if it was the additional powdered sugar or if it was the additional cartridge, but the combination of the two definitely made something that held up even to the heat of the waffles. Because usually, as soon as it hits those waffles, it just starts to melt and turn really watery. So I was very pleased with these results. Both the children were pleased both with the taste of the sourdough waffles as well as the texture of that coconut cream. So you don't need dairy to have a delicious whipped cream. It just takes a little creativity here. So we did have a few waffles that were left over since I had done a triple batch. And whenever I have leftover waffles like this, the next day I will make a French toast casserole from those. And I've shown this to you guys many times. So basically, I just grease a 9x13 pan and break up all the leftover bread or waffles and spread it over the bottom of the pan and pour over a mixture of eggs and milk and spices, just like you would do with French toast that you're making. Bake it in the oven, and then we served it with some bacon and maple syrup here on this day. But all right, let's do another sourdough breakfast recipe. We are going to make sourdough jelly rolls. Now, several videos ago, I showed you the sourdough cinnamon roll recipe, but I made it with pre-ground flour that was white flour. This time, I'm going to make it with whole grain flour that is freshly milled. The texture is definitely going to be a little bit different. So the first thing I did is I added 5 cups of flour, and now to that I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1 teaspoon of baking soda, as well as about 1½ teaspoons of salt. Those are our dry ingredients that we're going to mix together. I am leaving out the sugar because we are out of regular sugar and there will be sugar in the filling. Now to this, I'm going to add 1 cup of sourdough starter. That is what makes these sourdough rolls and will give it that flavor. And then I am also adding 2 cups of almond milk. And then other than that, we just need to add our fat. And for these today, I'm going to add 1 cup of regular olive oil. And then we're going to get this all mixed together. And like I said, we don't need sugar in the bread part of this because we are going to add a jam to the filling of this that has sugar in it. And we are also going to glaze over the top with a powdered sugar glaze. So I think that's more than enough sweetness for these rolls. We're just going to get that dough mixture rolled out and then we're going to fill them. And so to make jelly rolls, it's just like making cinnamon rolls, except we're going to spread our jam on the inside. So sometimes I like to do fruit butters in this. Sometimes I'll do jelly, but today we're using mulberry jam. I have 2 little half pints of mulberry jam. These were mulberries that we foraged for on our property last year or the year before. I can't remember when I made this jam. And we're just going to spread that over the top of our filling here. Now, the only thing that's different about making jelly rolls versus cinnamon rolls is that I find that if you roll these too tightly, the excess liquid in the center will start to just roll out of the sides and make a mess. So as I'm rolling this, I'm being really gentle and kind of lifting up and over to make sure that I'm not squeezing the roll too tightly, and that keeps the filling in there. Then I'm just going to grease my baking dish up and cut them and get them on the pan just like I do my cinnamon rolls. Then these are going to bake in the oven on 350 degrees for about 30 minutes or so. And while they're baking, we're going to get busy making that glaze that I mentioned. So it's just a simple powdered sugar, vanilla extract, and a little bit of water. And then after those have baked, we're going to pour the glaze over the top and just let them cool down for a second before they are served. So despite being whole grain flour with the bran in them, they did rise a little bit. The texture definitely isn't as soft as you get from a white flour. It's more dense, but it's still really delicious. And we just served that with some scrambled eggs that were cooked up in some bacon grease. And the kids had no complaints about this. And I was very happy. This was a little lower sugar and a healthier version of a cinnamon roll for the children. Now let's move on to another breakfast. So several videos ago, I mentioned to you guys that all of our storage apples that we kept out in our overflow fridge, these were apples that we got from Adam's grandpa's orchard last October. They were for fresh eating all through the winter, and they were doing just fine, but I forgot to bring them down into our cellar when we got our cold freeze, that really deep freeze in January. And so everything that was in the fridge out there froze solid. And when those apples thawed, they got rather mushy. And so I have just one little batch here of those apples left. And I thought I would make apple fritters for breakfast for the children as a way to use up some of those that are a little mushy. Now, some of our green apples are still rather firm and great for raw eating, but the red ones just really aren't a great texture. So this is a great way to use them up. We'll post the recipe in the video description, but I'm doing a double batch here, and I'm doing about 5 cups of this freshly ground flour. You would just do 4 cups if you have pre-ground flour. And to that, I'm adding 5 teaspoons of baking powder. From there, we're going to add just a little bit of salt, and then I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. Those are our dry ingredients. Some of you might be wondering why I add more of the freshly ground flour than I would if it were pre-ground flour. That's because when it's freshly ground, it's a lot fluffier than it is when it's packed in and pre-ground. So I do find that you need to add more flour to your standard pre-ground recipes in order to make them turn out in the same texture. So from there, I'm going to add 4 eggs to this mixture. And then I'm going to add 1.5 cups of liquid. You could do any kind of milk you wanted. I'm just doing water on this day because I don't have any dairy-free milks made up at this point in the morning. We're adding a little bit of vanilla extract. And then we're going to get all that mixed together, and those are all of our ingredients to make our fritters. Now, if you've never had a fritter, this is essentially just like a donut, but with apple chunks inside of it. Here are those apples that I mentioned, and anything that we don't use up this morning or that I can't save for fresh eating, we're going to turn into applesauce later. So then all I'm doing, I have some fat here in a pan, some lard here that we can deep fry our fritters into. We just put them maybe about a couple minutes on each side. You just want them to get kind of golden brown. Make sure they're not gooey in the middle anymore. Make sure you do both sides. And then when you serve them, you can sprinkle them with a little bit of powdered sugar. Just like with the other items I made this week, I don't add sugar to the batter if we're going to put sugar on top of it in the form of syrup or powdered sugar. So just a really fun breakfast. It's a little time intensive, so I don't do it that often, but this was our Friday morning breakfast where I was letting the kids kind of sleep in a little bit, and so I had a little extra time to spoil them. It was just a fun way to use up apples that are just not fun to eat raw right now because they're mushy. And so, like I said, the rest of the apples I'm going to work on cooking down and turning into applesauce. We'll either eat the applesauce fresh, or if I have too much, we will can it up and get it down in the root cellar. But it's since we're out of fresh apples, it's time to really start digging into that applesauce that we have in storage and a lot of the other canned fruit. And that's it for this week. We really are in a place where we're starting to run out of some things. And so next week will be our last week of sharing meals. And in doing that, I'm going to show you some of the substitutions that I'm doing for some of our favorite things. I hope you're enjoying this series on the Three Rivers Challenge. And we will definitely be back next week with more. Until then, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Stay warm out there, friends. All right, bye.